Yes, I think one of the big challenges really in the study of climate change is in trying to find robust methods of calculating CO2 emissions from different transport modes, different logistical activities. A lot of work has been done in this area so far, so we're gradually ascending the learning curve on this. Regrettably, I think many companies are still using average values which are unrealistic, where they have little knowledge of some of the assumptions that have been made in calculating those figures, such things as the average loading of the vehicles in question. And unfortunately, that can give us a distorted view of the relative carbon impact of different transport modes. Yes, that would be the holy grail, if ever we could have such a thing. I think my hope is that eventually we will see greater energy and CO2 transparency across the supply chain. One of the problems at the moment, I think, is that many companies that outsource their transport don't have access to the energy data. You know, that information is held by the carriers. So many of the users of these transport services have to find some other means of trying to estimate their carbon footprint, you know, doing conversions from ton kilometres into CO2. And for that purpose, they use just average carbon intensity values. And one thing we've done recently is review the published carbon intensity values, and you find that they vary quite enormously for transport modes and for countries. But eventually the hope is that all users of transport will get access to the energy data, and they'll be able to work out specific carbon values for their particular operations. But it may take us 10 or 15 years maybe to get to that position. Uncertainty is a constant problem. I think one thing we can do is encourage maximum transparency in this, so that the people who are providing us with carbon data should be fairly open about the sources of the primary data, about the assumptions they've been making, about the methodology that they've employed, so that the person interpreting that data can have some understanding of how the numbers have been derived. Regrettably, a lot of the transport-related carbon data in the public domain at the present time it seems to have been derived from black boxes, and so we don't have an insight into the origins of those numbers, and I've always counsel that those numbers should be used very cautiously. The hope is that through time, as our knowledge accumulates in this area, as more data becomes available, as we develop more sophisticated systems for analysing it, we'll be able to reduce the confidence limits and build up the level of certainty in the numbers. But it'll be a slow and painful process, I'm sure. And it's not even just a case of reducing the uncertainty, it's also a case of trying to improve the consistency of the numbers and apply more general standards here in the way that we collect the numbers, and also in the way in which we analyse and interpret the data as well. I must confess to being very sceptical about the practicality and the benefits of putting carbon labels on individual products. You know, some people subscribe to the view that once you tell consumers how much CO2 has been emitted by the production and distribution of a product, that consumer behaviour will then change, and we will then move towards a sort of new generation of low carbon products. But first of all, I don't think it's going to be that easy to induce a change in consumer behaviour. But I think it's going to be also very difficult to carbon audit supply chains at a product level, which you'd have to do to be able to put a carbon label in products. The research that we've done suggests that this is a very time-consuming, very laborious, very expensive process, and at the end of the day, there's still a large amount of uncertainty. The other possibility is that if carbon labelling of products did influence companies' market shares, then companies would be tempted to under-declare their CO2 emissions. So there would therefore have to be a parallel system of auditing to make sure that the figures companies were reporting were actually accurate. So many of the best practice measures that will cut carbon and energy as well as cost by making transport cheaper may encourage companies to use more transport, or it may cause them to reconfigure their logistics systems so that they cut their warehousing costs and reduce their inventory, but perhaps at the expense of more transport. And I think there are various responses to that question. One is to say that the expectation is that the cost of energy is going to rise through time, that in the longer term oil prices will almost certainly rise. So that will offset some of the energy savings that we make from applying more grid fuel efficiency. It may also be the case that governments will also increase the level of environmental taxation as well, so that government taxation may capture then some of the cost savings that are made by applying these efficiency measures, and that would then tend to suppress some of these second order effects. So presumably any carbon tax would be in addition to the current level of taxation on fuel, which is already at a very high level, and that is not going to go down very well with the haulage industry and with users of freight transport services. So politicians have a difficult task, I think, in trying to raise a level of taxation on what is already a fairly heavily taxed sector of the economy. I think the first thing I would say to companies would be that most of the measures they would implement to cut carbon would also save money. In many cases, this simply involves applying good business practice, which will cut energy consumption and CO2. Indeed, many of the decarbonisation measures would be self-financing and would offer quite a rapid payback as well. As for what those measures would be, I think the research that's been done has suggested that some measures are really quite cost-effective in cutting carbon. Driver training is one, and certainly in the case of road freight, training drivers in eco-driving techniques, and then putting in place an incentive structure to make sure that they continue to apply those good driving habits. So I think there are two of the main measures I think that companies should apply. But at present, one thing that we lack is a comprehensive data set on the relative cost effectiveness of applying a whole range of decarbonisation measures in logistics. We've got anecdotal evidence from a few companies that have applied measures, but what would be nice would be if we had industry-wide data which would then be available to other companies so that they could see what would be the likely carbon benefits of applying a whole range of different techniques, and I think we're some way from achieving that as yet. One would hope so. I mean, there are some examples of that happening, where companies outsource their logistics on a dedicated contract basis. Sometimes the contract is what we call an open book contract, where the client knows how much is spent on the fuel, and therefore they can work out how much fuel is consumed. So that does happen in some sectors. The problem is much more where it's a groupage type operation, when it's not dedicated or exclusive. And one would hope that through time there would be greater openness in this area. The other possibility, of course, is that the legislators might require this. We saw the situation in France recently, where the government was about to require road hauliers to require them to disclose the carbon emitted by each consignment that they handled. In the end, they abandoned that legislation, but it may be there'll be a need for some government regulation to force transport companies to divulge information about energy and CO2 to their clients. I think NTM has a very strong global reputation in this area. The work that NTM has done in compiling data on the environmental effects of transport, I think are well respected worldwide and used by many organisations, and we've used it in our research and with other projects that we have done. In addition to that, I think they have done some very innovative, original work in developing methodologies for assessing the environmental effects of transport. So I think as researchers in this field around the world, we're indebted to the organisation really for the work that it's been doing in this area.